The dog had been sitting at the gate every morning for 2 years. The neighbors on the coastal road outside Astoria, Oregon knew this, the way coastal people know things about their landscape, not because they had counted or recorded it, but because she had simply become part of the morning, the way the tide and the fog and the sound of the water against the rocks were part of the morning, reliable and unremarkable until the day you stopped and thought about it, and understood that something was waiting for a thing that was not coming back, and had decided to wait anyway. Her name was Kuma, which meant bear in Japanese, and she had been given that name by a man named James Nakamura, who had died 14 months ago at the age of 81, a retired fisherman from Astoria whose family had been on this Oregon coast for 3 generations, and whose grandson had not come to the funeral. His grandson's name was Liam. He had been a Navy SEAL for 17 years, and the reason he had not come to the funeral was the same reason he had not come back to Astoria in 6 years, and the reason for that was a conversation he had with his grandfather on the porch of this cabin on a rainy October evening 6 years ago that had ended with both of them saying things that could not be unsaid, and then one of them leaving, and the one who left was Liam, and the one who stayed was James, and then James died. And now the dog sat at the gate every morning, and the gate was locked, and the property had passed to Liam in a will that the attorney had forwarded to an address in Virginia that was 6 months out of date by the time it arrived, and none of this had resolved anything. If this story finds you tonight, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and subscribe to this channel before we go further. Because what happened when Liam Nakamura finally drove the coast road back to Astoria and stopped his truck in front of that gate was not a homecoming in any comfortable sense of the word. It was the beginning of the only conversation he had never been able to finish, with the one person who had died before he could finish it, being continued by the only living thing his grandfather had left behind. Liam Nakamura was 48 years old and Japanese-American in the specific way of third-generation Pacific Coast families, which meant that the Japanese part was precise and cultural and privately maintained, something that lived in the way his grandmother had kept her kitchen, and the way his grandfather bowed slightly when he shook a stranger's hand, and the way Liam himself, when he was very small, had sat in the fishing boat watching his grandfather work and understood without being told that this was what it meant to belong to something. His grandfather James had come to Oregon from California at 19, the son of parents who had been interned at Tule Lake during the Second World War, and had rebuilt their lives in Astoria with the particular, undemonstrative determination of people who have been told they do not belong to the country they have given everything to, and who have chosen, as a form of resistance, to give it everything anyway. Liam had grown up with this story not as a grievance but as a foundation, a thing that said, this is what your people do with difficulty. They stay, they work, they contribute. They do not complain in ways that require the world to accommodate them. He had joined the Navy at 21 as an extension of this understanding, and had become a SEAL at 24, and had served with the specific, quiet competence of a man who has been taught since childhood that competence is its own form of dignity. He had been good at the work and had loved it in the way you love a thing that asks the best of you constantly, and he had carried it home in the way you carry a thing that has taken a great deal as well as given it. His grandfather James had been the central figure of his childhood in a way that neither of his parents, both of whom worked long hours and were decent and present, but not available in the particular way that James was available, had been. James fished the Pacific coast and told Liam stories about his parents and their parents and the years at Tule Lake with a precision and directness that the official family version of those events did not contain, because James believed that a person should know exactly what their family had survived rather than a softened version of it. He told Liam about the guard towers and the barracks and the way his mother had kept a small garden in the dirt of the camp, because a garden was proof that you intended to continue. He told him about coming back to a coast that had changed, and a community that had not quite returned to what it was before. He told him that the choice he had made, to stay, to rebuild, to fish these waters and raise a family and never perform bitterness for people who expected it, was the most radical thing a Nakamura had ever done, and that Liam should understand this. Liam understood it. He carried it into his Navy career and into his SEAL training and into every deployment. the understanding that showing up fully was its own form of protest against everything that said you should not be here. He had called his grandfather every week from wherever he was in the world, every week for 17 years, because his grandfather was the one person to whom he could say the truth about what he was doing and have it received without either glorification or horror, simply as the truth. And then, 6 years ago, on a porch in Astoria in the rain, he had said something that was not the truth, or was not the whole truth. And his grandfather had said something back that was entirely the truth and that Liam was not ready to receive, and Liam had left. The argument had been about Liam's decision to extend his service contract for what would have been his fifth consecutive long deployment, and it had been, on its surface, about time and absence and the ways in which Liam's life had become entirely the mission and not enough of anything else. But underneath it, which was where James had always been willing to go even when Liam was not, it had been about something that James had watched accumulate over years of weekly phone calls, which was the specific way Liam had begun to use the work to avoid the question of what was underneath it. James had said, precisely and without cushioning, that he had watched Liam become someone who was excellent at everything the Navy required and had forgotten how to be excellent at being a person, and that this was a choice Liam was making, and that James was old enough to say plainly that he was afraid of what it was going to cost him in the years ahead. Liam had heard this as criticism of the work he had dedicated his life to, which was not what it was, and had said so in terms that he regretted within the hour but had not been able to walk back. And he had driven away from Astoria, telling himself he would call when things settled, and things had not settled in 6 years. And now James was gone and the property was his, and the dog sat at the gate every morning, and there was nothing left to settle before. He drove to Astoria on a Tuesday in February, which was not a considered choice, just the day the leave was approved, and the truck was loaded, and the road was there. The drive from Virginia to Oregon was 4 days, and he did not rush it because rushing it would have required knowing what he was driving toward, and he did not know that yet. He knew the property was there and the dog was there, because the neighbor woman, a retired schoolteacher named Clara Odom who had been looking after Kuma since James died, had sent him a letter through the attorney that said simply, "Your grandfather's dog is here, and I am too old to keep her properly, and she needs to go home, wherever that turns out to be." Clara was 73, direct in the way of certain Pacific Northwest women who have lived close enough to weather to have stopped softening their edges, and her letter had the effect of something thrown accurately from a long distance. Liam had not answered it. He had driven to Astoria instead. He stopped the truck on the coastal road in front of the gate at 8 in the morning, which was, as it happened, exactly when Kuma arrived at the gate each morning. And so the truck and the dog were at the gate simultaneously for the first time, and Kuma looked at the truck and then looked at Liam when he got out, and her ears went forward, and her body went still, in the specific way of an Akita, that is processing information before deciding what to do with it. She was large, silver and white, with the dense double coat of the breed and the broad, serious face and the dark eyes that Akitas carry with a quality that people often describe as ancient, as if the breed has access to a longer view than other dogs. She had a faded brass tag on her collar that Liam could not read from the road. She did not bark. She did not approach the gate. She simply looked at him with those dark eyes and waited for him to decide what to do, which was also, he reflected, exactly what his grandfather had always done. Clara Odom appeared from the cabin 10 minutes later, having seen the truck from the kitchen window, and she came down the path with a coat over her shoulders and a direct expression that confirmed everything her letter had suggested about her personality. She was compact and gray-haired, and she looked at Liam with the assessment of someone who has been waiting for a specific person to arrive and is now deciding whether he is the version she was hoping for. She said, "You must be Liam," and he said yes, and she said good, and unlocked the gate, and Kuma walked through and stopped 2 feet from Liam and sat down and looked at him and waited. Liam looked at the tag. It said Kuma on one side and James Nakamura on the other, and a phone number that was no longer connected. He crouched down in front of her, and she let him, and when his hand was 6 inches from her face, she extended her broad head and pressed her nose to his palm, and then she stood and turned and walked back toward the cabin, and he understood that he was supposed to follow. Clara told him everything she knew over coffee at the kitchen table that smelled of James's coffee, which was a specific smell that Liam had grown up with and had not smelled in 6 years, and which arrived in his chest like something that had been waiting to arrive. She told him that Kuma had been James's dog for 3 years, purchased as a companion dog when James's hip had made the boat work impossible, and that James had trained her the way he did everything, carefully and patiently and without shortcuts. She told him that after James died, Kuma had taken up her post at the gate within 3 days, and that nothing Clara had tried had persuaded her to stop coming to the gate at 8 in the morning and sitting there for an hour, looking at the coastal road, before returning to the cabin. She told him that she had mentioned this to the veterinarian in Astoria, a young man who had explained it as a grief behavior common in dogs, and that she had understood this explanation intellectually without finding it sufficient. Liam listened and did not say anything for a long time, and Kuma lay at his feet under the table, which she had apparently never done with Clara, who noted this without comment. The first week Liam spent at the cabin was the first week he had spent entirely without structure in 17 years of military service, and the absence of structure was louder than he expected. There was no mission. There was no briefing. There was no next step that someone else had determined, and that he was required to execute. There was a cabin that needed the winter's worth of small repairs that James had not been able to manage before he died, a dock that needed 2 boards replaced, a truck battery that needed charging, a dog that needed walking and feeding, and the particular quality of presence that Kuma appeared to require, which was not constant attention but consistent proximity. She did not demand anything from him. She was simply always aware of where he was in the cabin and in the yard, and when he was outside, she was outside, and when he was inside, she was somewhere in the same room. And this undemanding awareness was the most companionable thing he had experienced in longer than he could locate a date for. Clara came by most mornings with something from her kitchen and the kind of conversation that moved at whatever speed Liam needed it to move, which was slow. She had known James for 30 years, and she told Liam things about the last years of James's life that the phone calls had not contained. Because some things don't translate through phone calls, and some things a man saves for the people who are present. She told him that James had talked about Liam constantly, not with grievance, but with the specific combination of pride and sorrow that parents and grandparents carry about the people they love who are doing difficult, necessary things far away. She told him that James had understood, in the end, why Liam had left that evening and had said so, and had also understood, she thought, that Liam would come back when he was ready and that the coming back mattered more than the timing. She told Liam this on the 4th morning, and he sat with his coffee for a long time afterward and did not say anything. And Kuma sat beside his chair with her broad silver head close to his knee, and the Pacific outside the window was gray and flat and very large. The crisis came in the 3rd week, on a Thursday night when a February storm rolled in off the ocean with the speed and violence that Pacific coast storms arrive when they arrive without adequate warning, which was often. The wind came first, hard enough to take branches from the cedar trees along the coast road, and then the rain came, and then the power went, and then the tide, which had been running high all week from the previous storm, came over the sea wall at the south end of the road and began moving water toward the lower properties. Liam woke to the sound of Clara's phone. She had given him her number with the instruction to call if anything seemed wrong, and when he picked it up, it was Clara herself calling to say that the water was at her porch, steps and rising, and that she had sent her husband to a neighbor's house earlier in the week for his medication, and he had stayed there, and she was alone, and the car was in water past the door sills, and she was not certain what to do. Liam told her not to move, to stay on the highest floor, and dressed in the dark with Kuma watching from the doorway with the focused, serious attention of a dog that understands that the texture of the room has changed. He went out into the storm with the emergency kit he had packed by habit when he had arrived, because a SEAL's habits persist regardless of the civilian context, and Kuma came with him without being asked, which was also not a surprise. The coastal road was running a foot of water in the low sections, and the visibility was nearly nothing, and Liam moved through it the way his training had taught him to move through environments designed to disorient, systematically and with the body rather than with thought. Kuma stayed beside him through sections of the flooded road where he could feel the current pushing against his legs, and in 2 places where the road surface had become indistinguishable from the ditch beside it. She moved slightly ahead of him, and he understood from the way she was moving which part of the surface was solid, and he followed her. Clara's house was 400 meters from the cabin, and it took 20 minutes in the storm, and they reached it with the water at Liam's knees, and he went to the door, and Clara opened it immediately, dressed and holding a flashlight and a bag she had packed, because Clara was the kind of woman who packed a bag when things went wrong, rather than standing at the window hoping they would get better. He got her to the cabin and dry and wrapped in James's old wool blanket, and then he stood in the kitchen while she told him about the storm of 1998 that had done something similar, and the storm of 2007 that had been worse, and Kuma sat between them on the kitchen floor, and the wind worked the cabin the way Pacific storms work, the Oregon coast, with the thorough, impersonal effort of a force that does not distinguish between what it intends to damage and what it does not. By 3 in the morning the water was receding, which storms on this coast often did quickly when the tide turned, and by 5 it was possible to see the road again, and by first light the storm had moved inland and the morning had the washed, emptied quality that follows those storms, everything drenched and still and new-smelling. Liam sat on the porch with coffee, while Clara slept in the spare room, and Kuma sat beside him, and the ocean was still running high, but the light was coming. And James Nakamura's garden along the south fence was flattened by the storm and would need attention, and the dock had lost one of the 2 boards he had already planned to replace, which meant he was going to need to come back and do the job properly rather than halfway. He understood, in that specific early morning with the Pacific reorganizing itself below the cliff, and Kuma's breath making small clouds in the cold air beside him, that this was what James had been trying to say 6 years ago, on this same porch in the rain. Not that the work was wrong, or the service was wrong, but that a person needed a gate to come back to, something that waited at the same place every morning, something that knew you were gone and expected you to return. He had not had that, or he had refused to arrange it, which was not the same thing but had produced the same result, which was a life that was entirely constituted of mission and had forgotten the thing the mission was meant to protect. Clara, who appeared in the doorway at 7 with a sensible expression and no apparent acknowledgement that she had just been carried through a flood by her neighbor's estranged grandson, poured herself a coffee and said that the garden could be salvaged with work and that the dockboard was not as bad as it looked, and that James had left his tools in the shed, organized exactly the way he always organized them. Liam said he knew. She said good, and went back inside. And Kuma looked at him with those dark amber eyes that had been looking at the gate on the coastal road every morning for 2 years, and he understood that the gate question had been answered, and that the answer was that he was on the inside of it now, and that this was where the work was. He called his commanding officer the following week and began the paperwork for a transition to reserve status. He did not know precisely what came after, but he knew the dock needed 2 boards and the garden needed salvaging, and there was a cabin that had belonged to a man who had taught him what belonging looked like, and that Kuma had been sitting at the gate every morning for 2 years, and that when he had appeared at the gate she had pressed her nose to his palm and turned toward the cabin, and that this was the most unambiguous homecoming he had ever received from anyone, and that he intended to honor it. Some homecomings do not arrive with flags or ceremony. Some of them arrive in a storm at 5 in the morning on a Pacific Coast porch, with a large silver dog sitting beside you and an ocean that is too large and too old to be interested in the particular scale of one man's reckoning with where he belongs. Liam Nakamura had been an excellent Navy SEAL, and he was going to need to find out, carefully and without rushing it, what he was going to be excellent at next. Kuma appeared to have already formed a view on this subject, and he intended to defer to her judgment, which was the most sensible decision he had made in 6 years. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who has a gate they have not come back to. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and which city you are watching from. And if you can, support a Japanese-American heritage organization or a veteran transition program near you, because both of those things are doing necessary work. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep finding these stories, the ones that begin at gates and end somewhere the road did not show on any map.